Hello everyone, today we talk about the Indo-European Holy War. We have already talked about the Indo-European religious military system of beliefs. We'll talk often about crusades and also about the jihad and so on. And we have, of course, come to the most obvious conclusion that is appallingly and inexplicably and or at least unfortunately explicably, but still not very flattering so for our own civilization. Realization that, of course, every army in history has always fought in the name of God in every single time, right? This was not a theistic invention. The same concept of theism actually is often used in an oppositional sense to whatever existed before. This is this is mostly, as we will see, the product of a brutal and mostly leftistic secularization and modernization of our culture that was artificially imposed after times that were evidently needing, to pose some question about the most, extreme accomplishments of idealism, but that have nothing to do with the morally and scientifically correct understanding of history, that for some reason has, however, been in fact managed to be taken out from our horizons. And so talking about these topics is always fascinating, first of all, because the subject is beautiful, but it also feels like kind of a imperative duty. We're talking about the imperium in an Indo-European sense, of course. Here that is the whole point of the story, to properly share this knowledge, which is truly universal in nature, right, and has nothing to do actually with the monopolization of this by the alt-right that actually, as far as I've had the displeasure of meeting anybody of them, as much as extreme leftists. Fundamentally, they all revealed their complete illiteracy on any single cultural ground of what Indo-European morality was factually about, and so that's also what poses me, I think, an absolutely uncontroversial position relatively to these things, because I also came to them relatively later in time when I had matured something that was definitely, I think, I don't like to boast my titles, but at least I have my chevrons, and I did too, had own more extremistic ideas when I was younger, but I cured myself back in the day, through history itself. And so I believe that telling these things out there is to actually to acknowledge some of the greatest amount of in fact, the disease that we are living today, under everybody's eyes, without even the necessity of having to explain this at this point, through the same. So I still haven't created a playlist on Indo-European history, but I have begun to talk about this. We talked about the Hellenic cycle, we talked about the Roman cycle, and about some other interesting aspect of what mostly also for our series on the history of knighthood, and how the thing developed from essentially prehistory and so on. And so going straight to the point, today we talk about the concept of holy war, and for the ancient Indo-European warrior. And when I talk Indo-Europeans here, I talk really something that was much more broad, right, and universal, right? We talk Indo-Europeans because we talk about specific evidence and specific contexts, and in times where effectively the Indo-Europeans, as far as Western Eurasia was concerned, factually dominated most of these military cultures. And there were others in the Mediterranean, of course, that had developed fundamentally quite similar, if not properly the same systems. They shared basically the same religious military view of mankind, and this was present all over the world, right? Eventually, let's say in the West, we made probably a better job at studying this from a properly history of religion, anthropology, and so on. And we had the luck also as Westerners to have documented over the millennia let's say the same divides that existed within ourselves in terms of development, so that we can track, for example, a Nordic Germanic reality that is that even here shared actually some of what any other Indo-European people had believed at some stages of its development, and other people at the same time, but in times where there was somebody else that was civilized enough to document this, right, in written form. And this is something that I'm not aware in other continents to have existed by the same scale we've had here in Europe, so that we have this incredible treasure of that from these mythologies that, however, do not make any sense if not compared, right? And that's why today we could easily shift towards other, Celtic, Hellenic, Roman, etc. Today we base ourselves mostly on the Germanic and the Vedic religion. We will, for some of you, surprisingly enough, talk also about Islam, because we will see that the same concept of jihad actually derives from the Iranian tradition, from the Persians, from the same Indo-European one that the Arabs probably owned, but given that they were just Bedouin tribes, at least from the Hijaz, they had never developed in the same form that eventually their culture took shape like, in essentially superimposing to the Persian one, at least in the Middle East, and then being dramatically informed by the same, but also by the same Roman one, by the way. So it's and the same Christian, right? We will talk about the Templars of Bernard of Clairvaux, and seeing how even the Crusades, as I was saying before, the concept of holy war, are nothing fundamentally but not the copy or the superimposition necessary, but simply the natural, direct continuation of what basically every single people had believed historically about war and the holiness of the same, right? I made, as you know, as we were saying before, several videos about the Crusades, and I'm highly disappointed, even talking with alleged experts on the Crusades, that basically there is still a completely secularized and modernistic study today. The most, the greatest expert of Crusades, just completely study mostly the Crusades without having the palest idea of what properly the hell that these religions were about, where they were coming from, right? If you think that Christianity stole anything from this, but you're deluding yourself in a modernistic principle, because Christianity was simply emerging from the unique reality of that world that was believing about these things, and so it did nothing but continuing it on the same basis. The Jews believed the same things, the other peoples believed the same. So, and the same concept of demonization, the struggle between good and evil, and the idea that paganism went all together to constitute what the devilish thing that the evil, terrible Christians repressed in that, confined in that space. It's yet another severe delusion and complete lack of any education in the field, to know that the Uranic light spiritual principle of Christianity is nothing but mirroring the same same Indo-European religion in that sense, right, as in other cultures, by the way. And the Indo-Europeans believed in their damned, in their demons, in the dark side that had to be confined under the earth as an inferior thing. So it was exactly the same identical thing, right? And the way we have been fed other, the fairy tale that this was otherwise is just possibly, I think, at this point in history, the greatest lie in the history of mankind. Because if you look at the magnitude and the essential and all-encompassing dimension this had, and we have historiography having said this, right? This is a lie, which is striking because it's not something that we discovered magically now in 2022. Historiography normally in the 19th century and 20th century studied this as if you study history of, in the European religions. It's all laid out there. It's no mystery for everybody. Just take a book. But this is being purposely concealed for reasons at some point we will resume, also because if they hope to do this to stop racism or fascism or Nazism and all these things, the result was effectively the complete opposite of it, right? Because this just made triumphing the complete lack of any aristocratic superior moral principle that has just let free the obscure Dionysian forces of the fourth state, from which all the totalitarian regimes and their socialistic matrix need in order to achieve their plans. So It's an extremely disturbing thing, and I hope that these videos, that I don't have much following, but I hope they're gonna shake some conscience at some level, because these things, it's literally what the entire history has been, and this very tiny last 2 or 3 generations fundamentally have decided purposely, artificially, to let people completely unaware of this by essentially distracting them with other things. Because again, pick any book on this religious history, it's all laid out there with an oceanic historiography, a very, very well researched historically, religiously, anthropologically, literally, philologically, enormous amount of research, amount of material. So anyhow, so for the ancient Indo-European warrior, war essentially corresponded to the eternal struggle between metaphysical forces. The struggle is, of course, the one between good and evil. On the one hand was the Olympic principle of light, so the Uranic and solar reality, and the celestial one in a broader sense, because the whole Indo-European religion was based essentially on the earthly replica, on all the celestial movements and bodies, and the entire Indo-European languages are structured and designed with that specific meaning. At some point we will have to make some videos on the vocabulary, because essentially the languages that we speak today are still containing this, right? And whenever you speak certain, you pronounce certain sounds, use certain phonemes, we are still actually psychologically associating that sound exactly to the millenary semantics that was provided with by Indo-Europeans, that we have all in common in the Indo-European languages. On the other side, you have the brutal, that is the brutal element, right? Not the violent one in the sense that violence, is bad, right? Of course, the violence is how you use it, and of course the Olympic principle was meant to curb these negative forces in an equally violent way. But these were the stupid ones, right? The irrational, the emotionalistic ones, the titanic, telluric element, barbaric in the classical sense of the word, right? The idea that these were essentially, they had a feminine, demonic, in a metaphysical sense, character proper, that reflected the fatalism that the pre-Indo-European populations that these Caucasian semi-nomads came to rule over were obsessed with, because of the connection, their dependency on something outer of themselves, of their own moral center of gravity, and chiefly, in fact, the earth, and this obsession with physical, everything physical, right? That undermined instead the spiritual dimension. That was the only one that, in a kind of apathetic way, the Indo-European hero had to pursue, right? Not suffering, but still, while suffering, not giving a damn and acting anyway. And so the theme of this metaphysical struggle returns in 1,000 ways of appearance in all the traditions of Indo-European origin. Everywhere. Basically, you study the whole Indo-European religions, they are exclusively about this. There is nothing else out of this concept. Any struggle in the material world, let's say, was always believed with the greater or lesser awareness that it was simply an episode of such antithesis. This is a deep neurocognitive realization. Is the idea properly that everything we do is without any boundary connected to a struggle between good and evil. This is a principle that you find basically in all religions. In the same Christianity, there is never, if you think that you can live just by, somebody setting a standard for you and you just following it, you just fall short of the expectation of any religion. Because you're just essentially depending on something else. You're not making an active choice anymore, right? If you read the Gospels, the entire thing is apparently ambiguous, because it's expressing certain concepts that do not find a categorical application, because you're obviously called to discriminate on the base of your own resources, on your own mind. That is also how you're you're going to make the difference for yourself, right? With the works and everything, because it wouldn't make sense to presume that anybody actually even knows what the truth is. Nobody does, and so what you're being evaluated on, even though you're limited in this sense, is on your capacity to approach that limit, right? And so what the Indo-European hero also embodies in that sense is not very different from the Christian saint or the saint Jesus, given that there is properly a transfiguration in the moment of the rise to heaven, in the moment of the ultimate sacrifice. That, of course, had a military meaning, right? Also in the Gospels, this is actually expressed, and not only. But this was the, again, exclusive, unique, unescapable ethos that all these peoples had always had, right? And in some measure, of course, this was part also of the same populations in a way were subjugated, but this is exactly the concept in this world, that everything negative that happens to you, fundamentally, it's your fault, right? Or at least in the measure in which it becomes negative for you, it equates to your own incapacity and unfitness to accept it in the way you should, given that who are you to even pretend to claim that you're owed something in this world, which is a deeply moral realization that apparently today, is going completely in the other direction, so that we are essentially moving towards that, barbaric, demonic direction, that everything is owed, and so everything is also, the more distant you are from any kind of self capacity, and always more depending on basically on things that lay out of yourself, are ever more limited and ever narrower, in the sense of an ever smaller understanding of reality. And since, let's say, the Indo-Europeans considered themselves as a militia of the Olympic principle, so among them we also must bring back to this view the legitimacy or the supreme consecration of the right to power, and thus of the imperial conception itself. This is banally the imperium, the same meaning of the Roman, the imperium Romanly meant is exactly this: is the faculty of ruling. It's a religious military prerogative that is obviously intended in a sacred sense, right, and based on the capacity of the imperator, or he who receives from the celestial deity of war, the omnipowerful one, and by, in this sense, of the force of the universe, the primary force of the unique force of the universe. So reflect also on the concept of theism or polytheism, because that's yet another modernistic invention. Such thing never exists. Such distinction never exists. There was never a moment in which there was a polytheistic thing, because, by the way, even properly the concept of polytheism is wrong. It never existed historically. But we call paganism was a completely different thing. And also there was never like the creation of a theism out of a monotheism created out of nothing. And what is theism in the first place relatively to the divinity in itself? So, of course, this is something we find in all these populations and beyond, right? All the winged symbols, essentially, the glory descending from the sky and crowning fundamentally the victorious commander, right? This is for example, what the entire and exclusive and absolute meaning of any Roman political institution was, and the one that every single other empire shared, the Achaemenids, even the smallest tribes, the concept was always the same. If you won, you had that right, you had won that faculty, and it was never over, by the way, because when it is over, of course, we're going to tie this strongly to a Clausewitzian mentality itself, because that's the same thing that von Clausewitz says. When is that you actually stop, say, I'm safe, right? When does it end? When does a conflict originate and end, by the way? How can you tell when a war will end, or also one will start, right? Do you think there is a starting point and an arrival point when there is peace, abstractly meant, and that you don't have to feel challenged about or responsible or burdened by anything, because you want to just to be free, not have problems. That's not actually a very intelligent way of looking at reality, but also it's the best way to lose any kind of moral resistance towards anything, as a matter of fact. As remember that everything in the world was considered as a struggle between good and evil. And of course, the first one, as we will learn, is first of all the one that occurs within ourselves, which was quite iconically pictured in Indo-European religion. What do you think angels are? Have you ever wondered that? We will see it now. We will make a video about that because that's beautiful, by the way. In this traditional world, every reality became a symbol, which meant it had a deeper meaning that had to be deciphered. This also applies to war. From a subjective, meant not subjectivistically or relativistically, but properly from an individual point of view, and thus an interior one. War and the way of the divine would always merge into one and the same entity. In other words, if there is no struggle in humanity, there cannot be any improvement, elevation, growth. Everyone is aware of the significant testimonies that the Nordic Germanic traditions offer us. Albeit, of course, these traditions were equally, famously, let's say, handed down to us in a fragmentary, mixed way, right? They also represent in some way the materialization of higher primordial Indo-European traditions, often decayed at some point even to the level of popular superstitions, especially towards the end of the Viking era. But in general, consider that the Nordic Germanic world is peculiar because it's arguably among all the Indo-European mythologies, the ones that is mostly affected by the strength of the Telluric Dionysian forces, meaning that when the Indo-Europeans expanded also in the north, they were less because these were the least appealing lands, that whereas the stronger conquerors would go mostly towards the south and the richest. And so in those places, even for demographic dynamics, and you see that in the idea of the fall of the gods, this great struggle against the Titanic forces and so on, that this pre-Indo-European substratum was very strong and threatening, right? And therefore it acquires a much greater importance over the Indo-European element, so at a point of constantly threatening, right, from a quite concrete way from a moment to another, right? Whereas other, if you pick the Hellenic mythology, basically there is a foundational moment in which the tectonic forces are basically brought down, the order is established, and yes, there are some, let's say hybrids, and especially in the Hellenic world, but let's say the tradition at least was fixed in that sense, whereas in the Germanic Nordic world, the thing was kind of more, even to the point in which this was properly pictured and rationalized at some levels, it took, because of the stage of developments of those people, more time. But it's also closer to some spiritual elements of the same, or at least some, more original forms that you can, find in some details of the same mythology. First of all, as it's commonly known, the Valhalla is the seat of celestial immortality, reserved mainly for the heroes who have fallen on the battlefield. So you understand here easily the parallelisms that exist with other, with other mythologies. The Olympus, right? There are the heaven in general, right? And the lord of these places in the Nordic Germanic tradition, so Odin / Woden, is presented as the Ynglinga saga says, as the one with his symbolic sacrifice to the cosmic tree. Yggdrasil has shown the way to the warriors. That Odin, in order to achieve his powers, he killed himself, right? So he literally went where mortals cannot come back from, fundamentally, and that is the way that brings the lead. And it's a deeper wisdom. As you know, Odin is not really the Hercules of the situation, something else, and he embodies the wisdom, right, that comes in the wood, in a form of of something that goes beyond mere courage or strength, right, but has to do with properly the mechanism of a more rational, let's say more complex in this sense, more rationalized understanding of reality, paradoxically, even though, of course, there was a few rational in here, felt much decline to that word's context, but still, it was something superior, of course, to the one of the simply youthful and physically, capable warrior. So this was the way that leads to the divine seat. If you wanted to reach the Valhalla, you had to die in the first place. So this is the place where immortal life flourishes. And in according with this tradition, in fact, no sacrifice or cult is more pleasing to the supreme God. No one obtains richer otherworldly fruits than the sacrifice offered when one dies fighting on the battlefield. Does this remember you something? There is more to this. Behind the obscure and popular representation of the wildes Heer, right? So the wild band, you can argue the wild army, lies the following meaning. This is the wildes Heer is properly the symbol of the military, properly the warrior brotherhoods, right? Where people devoted to the divinity, once entering to that, literally going through ritual death, so that as human beings they factually did not exist anymore. They didn't have any minimal authority on themselves in the moment in which they entered that, and at best they could reach the top, right, and becoming the leaders themselves, but they were now something else forever. And that test was like a real death, right? It's not very different from when the training, I don't know, the Roman legions was said by Flavius Josephus was just equal to a military experience, because there was no other way for these peoples to train themselves, and it all passes from that moral conviction that you had achieved a status that was superior, basically transfiguring, say, at least at those levels, not completely, because of course that was a role destined just to the imperator, that was factually the medium, and hence called from between the deity of the skies and literally of how this might, this power that were of course otherworldly, would be delivered on earth through the retinue. So the wildes Heer is naturally Odin at the head of a retinue of armed men. This is the point. The same slaughtered warriors that access, in that sense, the glory of the Valhalla, because of now having to still participate to the cosmic fight, the end of time, which the entire world will be under threat. And this is just a super elite, right? Because in order to reach the Valhalla, you have to be someone, right? You don't have to be anyone. And this is the point. And it was highly elitistic and discriminatory. Don't you think that just because you're killed on a battlefield, you go to the Valhalla, do you? Right? But of course, the fourth state very often needs to believe this, like a bunch of idiots today that think they are, descending from these people and believing going to the Valhalla. Yes, being 21st century slobs that their ancestors would have simply spit in the face of before cutting them to pieces for the chthonic telluric shit that they are, and not understanding anything of what the hell that properly even means. This of course passed, through the warriors themselves, that by falling, offered voluntarily themselves, this is the point, as a sacrifice to Odin himself, right? So the ranks of those who this god needs for the last battle in the Ragnarok. So this is properly an end of time. When you think about the cyclicity, it says, theism brought us, the idea of linear time. There is always an eschatological view in the Indo-European religions as well. You think the world is going to last forever. It doesn't happen. Okay? So this is the fatal darkening of the divine. So pointing out, as we were saying before, this is quite evident in the Nordic Germanic tradition. So this incumbent condition of the world, which is threatened since the very beginning of times, right? This idea of the obscure forces always being one step away from prevailing, right? And this is really a great wake-up call for cultures like the Germanic ones that were dramatically unstable from a political point of view and were constantly involved in warfare, and that thus had to be very, very, very aware that in their worldview properly, this was the constant state of reality, and stressing it to this point so much that what will happen also is, it will be terrible, because some gods at least will fall, and the outcome is yet to be decided. And this is exactly what has to keep alive the military standards in these communities as well, because again, we need dramatically good warriors in the Valhalla. We need heroes. We don't need everybody. We need just a very, very elite selection that has to be virtually the one that can, parallel the same Odinic wisdom. It's a bit like saying, can you save yourself in the Judeo-Christian tradition? Well, there is the concept of original sin that these cultures didn't have, so change is a big deal in the game. But in a way, it's part of the same understanding. That is, if you don't challenge yourself to the point of saying that you should be perfect, how can you properly access the Valhalla itself? Right, so nobody could ever know, and if you had lowered the standard, you would have just lowered the quality in itself. This is present also in the Hellenic mythology. In order to be a hero, you have to be a real hero. You have to be able to do, superhuman things in the first place. And who can claim that? Like, who can claim to own the truth, or to fully believe in God? Really, nobody does. Right, because in the moment in which you do, you automatically, fill yourself with sin, or even more than the one you already are, and for which you should keep struggling in order to compensate in a way. And instead, you just say, after all, it's not a big deal. This is of course a huge issue also in broadly speaking, in monotheism that today is witnessed, that just the forms that Christianity has taken that have practically nothing to do, right, with the reality of the Christian faith in itself, right? Think about pacifism. Any pacifist is by definition not a Christian. This insane and frankly heretical belief that you should just see God as love, and not considering minimally his wrath. I know of paranoid people who need to say, I told me explicitly, I need to think that God is only love, and simply taking away the wrath, because if I think about that, I get more paranoid, and the only reason why I think this is because I had traumas with other people that left me paranoid. So we are creating factually mentally ill people who are not capable of achieving nothing anymore. And for in quality of life conditions that are ridiculously easy by any standard that these populations in the past had to undergo on a regular basis, and that they factually wouldn't complain much for, right? Crudely enough, they would also take measures to properly take out those elements that were not fit for it, and this is yet another brutal part of the story. But they were capable of doing that because they had a much more direct. They lived in worlds that were simpler to the point that, but not simpler as systems compared to ours. Not because they were less difficult to live in or to sort out or to require intelligence for that matter, but that showed much more directly the connection between causes and say actions and consequence in the first place. Whereas today we are dramatically more detached from that. And that's great part of the reason why also we arrived to this point. But that's another side of the matter. Now, so from here, therefore the Indo-European motive of the metaphysical struggle comes clearly to light. In the Edda, it is also said, quote, "However great the number of heroes gathered in the Valhalla may be, there will never be enough when the wolf breaks in." The wolf is the beast, right? It's the same exact tradition, satanic tradition in Christendom. The beast is something that you can never lower your guard for, right? Doesn't matter how many heroes. Like, you see, this is the beauty of the concept, because in order to be a hero, you have to go to the infinite. You have to reach the absolute, the truth, asymptotic. It's impossible for any human being, ideally, right? But, they would think it could be possible because just striving towards it made the possibility necessity. But not even an infinite number of infinitely capable heroes would be enough to be decisive in the clash against the beast in the end of times. And this is a dramatically beautiful idea, because it's essentially the same Clausewitzian concept that, of course, war is unpredictable. There is no way to sort out war positively speaking. You just have to go into it and see how it goes, and proving your capacity, which means being under the single greatest pressure in any condition in mankind, to move positive towards an objective that is defined at every step and that you may never know, because it's reciprocally, by the way, measured with your enemy that is fighting against you, right? It's not a passive thing, it's just another force that is always at least as powerful as you, if not properly, and if you just slip for a second, it's above you and you're dead, right? This is the concept that the Indo-Europeans had of the whole thing, right? And you effectively don't know how it can go. It will never be enough. You may never know how a war ends, what the consequences are going to be as well, right? So the wolf here stands as the image of the dark and savage forces that the world of the Asen, so the heroes, the gods, proper have temporarily managed to bind and subdue. But it's not going to be forever. It's never going to be forever. It could be tomorrow, right? This is the same eschatological view that lays at the end of saying, have you repented for your sins? Have you understood what is going to happen and what is happening at any moment in this world for you to even be still alive because of it? And bear in mind, in fact, that Odin has his own wolf, and that the wolf has a dual symbol, right? Fenrir is Odin's wolf, and in this sense he represents, however, also a potential threat. The symbol stands within here. Odin is the head of the war band, and the wolves are, of course, the young men who are passing through this ritual of passage, for which they have to properly to destroy themselves or to be rebuilt into something else. that as the youthful and wild and ferocious element is of the initiates is the wolf itself, and the wolf is dangerous. It's dangerous even for the shifting, right? Because these men are competing ferociously among one another. They're building, toughening that up in that meat grind. They're exposing in a fanatic way, in a way that, of course, is not the cold considered, rational one of the grizzled warrior. Still needs, of course, the virtus, the non-rational element, the courage to go out there to risk his life. But they are also the next possible rulers, right? So here, Odin himself is threatened by this, and that's why the idea of the wolf is the figure of the wolf is properly taken to maintain this dualistic the representation, right? The wolf is the inferior because it belongs to the lesser ranks of the war band, right? But it's still necessary in a sense to the world because, of course, the Indo-Europeans here are always mixed with the pre-existing population, so they have reached that level. But still, there is a superior spiritual principle that makes of those rule those who have managed to tame the beast and to lead it and to channel its power towards other directions. And in this growth process that also the war band entailed, because you entered like a nobody, and in theory you should have, died a chieftain, right, who had accomplished something in his life. Ideally, most would simply die along the way, and that's also what the hero is selected like. And so that's why it's, not really everybody who can be the head of the war band, and who can say even at that point that there are many war bands out there, or many rulers, tribes. So what's the thing, right? Odin is the symbol, and what's important here is the asymptotic direction of the same. Now, if we pass to the Indo-Aryan conception of Mithras, right, we see him as literally the sleepless, restless warrior. By definition, who at the head of the Frabashi and his faithful retinue battles the enemies of the Indo-European god of light in the same way. Now, the Frabashi, so Mithras is properly the hero of the situation, and the Frabashi, the etymology of which is connected in Sanskrit to properly the idea of choice, would be essentially a spiritual, soul, divine element that lives within us, and that has thus the possibility. It's our soul, right? Remember, the Disney cartoons with the angel and the devil, in the head of the characters that speak, and this is basically the same thing. You have a soul that has to decide, and this is the element of the soul that has the possibility of choosing properly between, rising the hero through heaven, making it a hero properly, raising the man, say, can become thus a hero to heaven through his deeds, or making it essentially a nothing. This is the concept of hell itself. Hell is not quite just the underworld, right? The ones of the Pelasgic, Chthonic, Dionysian, barbaric peoples that the Indo-Europeans had, barbaric at least in their own side, but let's say morally inferior. This was the idea. Of course, they were actually more advanced, but morally speaking, they were softer, and so they had been brought down. So that's how the Indo-Europeans saw their own moral superiority on them. And that is a non-place. It's a place where the soul eventually dies, melts away, where the body rots. Instead, it's swallowed by these deities that destroy it and create this other, fundamentally insignificant beings. The soul of the hero, instead, is eternal. He rises to heavens, sits next to the gods, because it has achieved that fulfillment of itself. And the Frabashi, in this sense, it's a bit the Roman Genius or the Valkyrie in the Germanic world. It's this alter ego of the warrior. In other words, his soul, but also an hypostasis, therefore, of himself, and however of victory. Right? These souls properly appear in front of the eyes of the warrior in the moment of his ascension to heaven, in the moment of the highest deed, in the moment of death, that is the moment of the ultimate sacrifice, these souls are all winged. The Roman Victoria, the Vedic Frabashi, the Germanic Valkyrie. This is essentially the hypostasis of divine glory that takes your soul, that you, while you see in the moment of your death this angel, that is the moment in which you have achieved eternal glory, and you will go to heaven because you have sacrificed yourself on the field of battle. You sacrifice yourself entirely, fully, from a moral and from a physical point of view, and you will rise to heaven. This is the meaning of angels, right? There is no other meaning of angels. Angels are creatures that in all these cultures, if you pick the Judeo-Christian one, if you pick the Indo-European one, they are all the same thing. That is essentially a divinized, say an hypostasis of the greater deity that essentially was the soul of a warrior that had won this heroic state next to God, having offered his life entirely for the divine principle, right? The angels in the Judaic tradition are also notoriously etheric figures. Satan is an angel. The Saint Michael that brings him properly down, because who dares to even think to be like God? This is the same principle of it. Who can dare to say that? It smashes it into the darkest of the abyss. Even, I don't know, in the Gaelic world, where all those deities in the Gaelic world, they're basically a divinized hero cult, right, on the mounds of Irish chieftains that have been killed, and for this reason they thought that people went praying there, trying to pick part of this of the emanation of this greatness of the soul. This is the same deified emperor during the Decursio, when all the the symbols of victory won under the emperor are thrown into the pyre with his corpse, so that they would fly back to heavens, to the heavens where they belonged. This is the same concept. So in other words, when you think of your angel, it's always the best that you can be. It's the choice in front of which you're put every single time in your life to make the better thing, for you to deserve to be a better person. This is a deep archetypical, moral, and also scientific principle, because fundamentally clinical psychology tells us that things really work in this way, right? And we are just essentially instead taking another path by saying, everything's fine. Never feel like, if you feel negative emotion, don't never think maybe it's your fault, or that you've done something wrong, or you just can't take your own responsibility. No, don't worry about that. It's not your fault. It's never your fault. It's the best way to de-responsibilize and to destroy a human being. So we will eventually speak of the Frabashi and compare their correspondence with the Valkyries of the Nordic tradition. But what is important here is mostly clarifying the meaning of holy war on the base of very important testimonies from these or derived contexts. And that's in fact where I pass to the Islamic tradition, because as we were saying before, I made videos about the Islamic invasions and conquests and so on, and perfectly well that these Arab tribes had always dwelt for millennia at the outskirts of millenary empires, including the Achaemenid one of Alexander, the Romans, the Persians, and all these great empires, of course, believed in the same principle, in the European principle. These Semitic peoples had actually some kind of the same. Some of the greatest, symbols for example, in the Iranian tradition were also borrowed from, these winged gods from the Mesopotamians. Well, in part, it's said even the Assyrians were partly Indo-Europeans. But this is not really a problem, because, as we were saying before, this concept is really universal by a certain degree. The point is that the Arabs up to that point, at least in the area from which the Islamic invasions would start, so not from the civilized south of the peninsula, but this other, in fact, quite warlike tribal caravan areas, let's say, had, of course, been informed in a certain way. These were peoples that had not been converted much to higher belief systems, because, in fact, of the minimal kind of level of their development, there's some, of course, there were some, of course, Zoroastrianism, some Jewish, even some Christian elements, especially in the cities. There were, the main market centers were, for obvious reasons, because they were the ones who were more in contact. But let's say the Bedouin in the country wasn't quite the same, receptive in the same way. But let's not underestimate the fact that it would have, in a way, just the same idea in principle. So Islam, in this, as you know, brought the thing to a next stage, to a much larger scale of ambition and conquest, right? What a Bedouin could strive for was, successfully sacking a caravan without getting killed in the process. At that point, was offered to them to take over the world, which in a sense they made, considering they stretched from the Atlantic to the Indus Valley. This idea of the Holy War is borrowed, at least properly in its full-fledged and structured, developed fashion, by the Indo-Iranian one, right? You could argue by some degree, of course, how this existed in also by Roman influence or by other influences, etc. But let's say that in a way the Persian model was the most impacting, right? The most influential, and also the most directly connected, at least with the ancient Indo-European spring. This idea of holy war reached the Arab tribes from the Persian cultural universe. It had, let's say, the meaning of the late Renaissance, of a primordial heritage at this point. That said, two holy wars can be distinguished in the Islamic tradition, that the Muslims distinguished exactly, I presume in memory, anthropologically speaking, of this divide between the before and the after. So, namely, in fact, and not respectively, but switched at the great and the small holy war. And this distinction is based on the saying of Muhammad himself, who, on his return from a warrior enterprise, said, quote, "From the small we have returned to the great holy war." This concept is fantastic, because you understand that the prophet here was identifying fundamentally the idea that there had always been universally recognized in the cults of these peoples the existence of a superior principle, right? And so what here Muhammad was essentially complaining about, in the fact that up to that point that greatness had been limited, and therefore also the capacities of these tribes had been much narrower. So some said that in this sense the great holy war belongs to a spiritual order. Naturally, it's more interesting to see this in a non-categorical sense, meaning that simply reasoning by scale and how much the effort that could be put in this enterprise and also its fruits could be measured like, right? So the little holy war is this idea, as I said before, maybe just sacking a caravan, right? And it's eventually also referred, at least conceptually, to the idea of a more material struggle. The idea you just fight for the richest is, in the sense, this lesser stage is referred to a materialistic view of life, right? It's in perfect coincidence with properly what the Indo-Europeans said themselves. So it was the war fought not much for in the outside world, but for the outside world in a sense, or at least in its strictly materialistic sense, right? Whereas the Great Holy War is the greatest one, is for the conquest of the world in its entirety, so in its divine perfection, and it also reflects, first of all, the higher wisdom, the higher understanding, that is the one deriving from the fact that the Great Holy War is the man's struggle against the enemies that he carries within himself. And this belongs also to the broadly Indo-European tradition of the, think about all the psychoanalytical meanings attached to the idea of the dragon living in the underworld. In other words, when you're fighting with the dragon, you're fighting within yourself from the depths of your souls, the most inexpressed, the ones you have to decipher, but that, however, if disclosed, will open to you to a treasure that lays within yourself in potential. And so that possibility of divine elevation of yourself, of transfiguration, of heroic transfiguration. More precisely, it is the struggle of the supernatural element in man against all that is instinctive, tied to passion, chaotic, subject to the forces of nature. Right, so again, the apathetic, stoic, Indo-European ideal, the idea that as long as, if you don't make sense of reality, if you don't go through your own experience, if you don't sort out things, if you don't make the effort to work within yourself to understand, you will always be tied to a superstition, which literally means to something that supersedes yourself, that stands above you and dominates you, whereas you should be dominating it. In other words, you would be the chthonic, barbaric, telluric element, and somebody else, somebody superior, will rule over you, and you have to switch the thing, or something anyway, because it's all about you. It's about how you see the thing. It's how much you are enlightened by the concept, right? This is fundamental. In other words, any emotionalism, any whining about, how things go bad, we should just cry over ourselves, asking us others for giving us stuff, and not to do anything about solving anything, and therefore becoming a parasite. Well, this is not exactly what the world entire believed at the time would be the answer, and it's dramatically fascinating enough to see that this seems to be the main, essentially political need that is felt nowadays by some standard. Who can change things? Do you think that you will inject some money in some people's account to resolve the utter complete moral misery in which individuals are, and not even taking them making them accountable for that? Well, good luck with that. You bought pure materialism, and that's the same reason why nobody has ever taught you this religious history, because as soon as you learn about it, you understand that all what you've been fed with was a lie. And in fact, this is also the idea that appears in the ancient treatise on an Indo-Aryan warrior wisdom, the beautiful in the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita. There are 700 verses about this cosmic metaphysical war that fundamentally puts Arjuna in front of this, in fact, inner struggle. Say, this just before, that the Veda didn't ever, like, archaeologically they're not documented. Like, we know they existed because in the Indian tradition, we have fortunately been handed over these poems. The Mahabharata is, like you say, the Iliad for the Westerners. And they all date back to this millennia before Christ and the Vedic invasion from the Western Eurasian steppes of the conquerors, at that time fighting still on chariots properly, and this is the world setting usually in which these fights take place, and that represents properly the hero in its highest form. That the hero, that's remarkable. That's the symbol of the heroic struggle. If you look at all, still even late Hellenic or Roman times, the hero still, the triumph is, the hero arrives on the battlefield or anywhere, transported by the same forces of nature that are the chariot and the horses and the retinue that made it happen. He doesn't have to do anything. His action is pure action. The only thing he has to do is to descend from the chariot, face in combat, challenging combat, the other the enemy hero that is obviously, the chthonic hero, because if it succumbs, it's because it's the negative one, and coming back on the chariot and going away. And that's basically the idea. And it's present on all the, in fact, Hellenic, Roman iconography. It's the principle of any single aristocratic, governmental, moral, religious ideal in all the ancient world. And there was nothing out of it. And if you see in this chariot, what happens is that there is always a winged figure flying over the hero, which is the Frabashi, as we were saying before. It's the same spirit of the hero that brings him in this moment to heavens, to the heaven itself, because of his greatness. And in the Veda here, these concepts are arguably the strongest of all the Indo-European tradition, because they are factually, even though they were handed down in this oral fashion, and for centuries, eventually just written down, they stem from the most original phases of Indo-European history that basically in Europe we don't have as that ancient, right? So, as you know, the Vedic religion is probably the closest to the Indo-European, the original Indo-European one from Sanskrit. Also in linguistics, it's one we understand the most when confronted with the other, Germanic, Hellenic, Italic, Celtic languages, and so on. So this is, so let's quote the Bhagavad Gita. It says, quote, "Through the realization of that which is beyond intellect, strengthen yourself through yourself and kill the enemy in the guise of desire, difficult to win." So this is the voice that comes probably from the genius that was following Arjuna in his struggle, right? Before his duel in the war, and basically that's what he tells him, that you have to realize what is beyond the intellect. That is to say, you have to realize what you yet haven't realized. You have always to make an effort as a perfect human to learn more in every single instant of your life. Strengthen yourself through yourself. There is not an external force that can do it for you. And if you search for it, you're already lost. You have to do it yourself. You have to spit blood. And you have to learn to spit blood on purpose. And to kill the enemy in the guise of a desire that is difficult to win. This is very relatable. How much, basically, arguably, I think neurocognitively all the time, we all know what we should do and we don't. Like picturing this tension, picturing this in the infinity of our possibilities, even though within the boundaries of our physical limits, means really to be able to reach the infinite in ways that we wouldn't even imagine. And this is exactly what it says. It's something that goes just apparently, in a sense, beyond the intellect. There is something that the intellect can't come to cover, but only in the moment in which you go out there for it, and not by itself. So an indispensable condition for the interior work of liberation is that such an enemy, like desire, must be definitively annihilated. Right? You have to live as if nothing would move you from your purposes. And this is, of course, impossible because your purposes are built in the real world. So that's why also the original sin in that way was just maybe some say, well, this kind of degraded the world vision, but in a sense it's a very spot on thing, right? You're not, you can't literally do everything. You can't always be perfect. You can't say always the truth, because what is the truth? You should just shut up for your entire life if you want to avoid, at least saying a lie, because according to the, to the Achaemenid view, to the Persian view, like the hero who said a lie would see his glory flying away from himself, and therefore his Frabashi would be lost forever. He would be without a soul anymore, and he would just remain with his shadow that will dissolve into earth and disappear. So we'll have lost the possibility of coming back to the divine, where we all stem. We're in this sense, the Indo-Europeans thought they had come from, in a sense, and they had the duty to return because of the blessing that heavens had made for them, right? So within the framework of a heroic tradition, that the little holy war, as we were saying before, that is a war as an external struggle, serves only as a way through which the great holy war is achieved, hence where it enters in function of it. Because, let's say, it's like the concept of the Christian concept of sin. You don't sin with actions, you actually sin with your mind, right? It's all the problem is what starts in your mind, and eventually consequences follow in the way you behave. But everything that happens on the outer side is, in that sense, just a manifestation of your direct responsibility, which starts from within a spirit, a soul, that we still factually have not the slight idea what the hell it even means in the first place in terms of our consciousness. And that was obviously seen, and if you stop to think it even just for a moment, as a divine thing. Because whatever it is, it's basically the single most self-mind-blowing thing that you should be, freak out at every moment. At least not freaking out, because that's anti-stoic in the European sense, but saying, wow, I have this, and I still complain about anything, and I still think, and just sitting here eating chips on the sofa watching Netflix. Because frankly, I don't know where you want to go with your life, but do you realize you're even alive and what this means? Well, no, because of course our culture has been purposely deprived of this concept. Because as long as people are mostly like this Dionysian chthonic masses of the cerebrates at this point, well, the better they are commanded by superior people. And they deserve that. Why? Because they are inferior. What is superior and inferior? It's relative depending on whom, right? And this is exactly what is happening. So at least don't complain. But that's part of the deal. You will complain if, you think your life, after all, feels, I can't fulfill it, I don't feel anything, I want more. It won't change anything, right? It won't fix itself because you will get more. That's an external thing. It has nothing to do with it. It has to do with your brain. So for this reason, holy war and God's way are often encountered in these texts as synonyms, right? For example, if we read the Quran, it says, those who sacrifice earthly life for the future life fight in the way of God, that is, in the holy war. Since we will award a great prize to him who fights and dies in God's way, or to him who wins. And further on, and those who are killed in the way of God, he will never lead their works to perdition. He will guide them and give peace to their hearts. He will introduce them to heaven, which he will reveal to them. So this is the perfect concept that, of course, speaks properly of sacrifice in battle, the ultimate one, but has to do with the, say, imagine this in a diluted from 0 to 100%. So this is 100%, but still if you achieve an 80, 76, you will feel that. That is to say, the closer you will arrive to the truth, the better we will. And of course, the 100% is death, because nobody can achieve properly the truth by himself, if not by dying. That is, it's not for this earth, but coming closer to the truth is possible, and the path is leading to the fight. For the cause, that is, of course, this is the point. The more you know about the world, and that the more you will feel engaged in the struggle, and the more you will be able to properly, you will automatically fight for it, because you will understand what is more important at that point. And here we allude naturally to physical death in war, the so-called mors triumphalis, as the Latins would say. It is the victorious death. A death worth the triumph in that regard, and in this sense, divinization. And the Roman triumph in this, as you know, properly the imperator to have the same semblance of Jupiter until he would bring properly the spoils of victory as, the sacrifice to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. So to symbolize that the imperator had transfigured, as if he had properly given all of himself, naturally, remaining alive in that context, but having properly witnessed the divine in that clamorous victory. So this is in perfect correspondence with the classical tradition as well. And naturally, the same doctrine can be interpreted in a symbolic sense as well, because, in the Small struggle, let's say, has known how to live a great holy war, has created within himself a force that enables him to overcome the crisis of death, right? So that even without being physically killed, he can, through the ascesis of action and struggle, experience death, and he may have conquered internally and achieved a modern life. So this is naturally impossible in the actual Indo-European tradition. This is truer in theism in a sense, though. But esoterically understood, this is properly paradise, the kingdom of heaven, right? Similar expressions are nothing more than the symbols and representations coined for the people of transcendent states of enlightenment on a higher plane of life or death, right? And after all, we all know as that slaughtering the dragon is a way of dying and being reborn from his blood, and so that is what we experience constantly in our life. Our growth passes through many deaths, right? Many internal breaks, right? It's the initiatory rate of the war bands, as I was saying before. You had to literally die and be reborn in another thing, and we know that we change, right? That we maintain, of course, our biological continuity also in thought, but this is still an improvement that we praise as such, right? Reason for which we invented even things like, age limits for stuff, because we know that normally, at least on average, there should be some kind of improvement over time through this struggle, right? So the extreme in this is, of course, the transfiguration in the divine. The best that you can be, in other words. So these considerations must also be valid as a premise for rediscovering the same Indo-European beliefs of meaning under the external guise of Christianity that too often we assume to be just, the alien thing that came out of nowhere, didn't have, had a completely different logic on its own, and was not connected to the obvious universal realizations of the time, which is of course ridiculous on any historical level. So when we look, for example, at the Nordic Western heroic tradition, and at the same time at the Crusades, right, we see there something happening. So as a medievalist, I cannot digress, as I was saying before, on the Crusades. I created an entire playlist dedicated to them. I don't know how many videos we made, like 70 or something. So if you're interested, I think I've never... I addressed these topics actually, but not with such a specific a history of religion cut. Make the point, but indeed we can see in lots of the Crusade, aside from the... What really made the Crusades, in a historical sense, was the fact that there was a monarchic papal direction of the same, right? There was definitely a different terminology and procedure, and there was something very specific about the Crusade taking form, but that was not essential within the same, right? We focus too much on that surrounding. This is a huge problem of historiography, as I was saying before, as most of the one existing on chivalry and the crusade and so on, knighthood still revolves around the older structural Marxist, biased perspective of just let's look at the socioeconomic cost of the knight, and who knows why, we cannot really know what they believe. We actually know what they believe. Like we cannot feel it the way they did, but that's basically the single most important thing to make it do, because otherwise how can you explain the Crusades otherwise, by the way? And of course it was much more of material aspects, but the human experience is unavoidably both. And as we've just said, there is the smaller element to that, but the broader leading principle is, why do humans do anything in the first place? Which is not explained in a mechanistic, materialistic sense, as they would like instead to impose on you, because in order to hope to make you forget about what can absolutely destroy any of the establishment based on such lies, there is a spirit in the Crusade that you can see as a moral reinvigoration, or at least channeling, because of the availability of moral and material resources alike of the West in that specific context, as a reaction to the Islamic conquests, as Crusades definitely did not even begin as this broader papal direction in 1095. They were something that the Western Christendom was already, pioneering, and on some other theaters, namely the Western Mediterranean one, and and generally speaking, you can see in the warlikeness also of the elements, especially of the barons, of the property of the military, that much of that broader unsecularized and traditional forces were there, in the sense of a quite also ambiguous hybrid sometimes between, let's say, a Christian and pagan mindset. Some of these people had been just converted in this few generations before, but that's not the point. The point is that still Christians univocally believed in the thing, and the reason why the Crusades happen is mostly of course political, as always, in the sense that without the papal guidance would have not properly taken the form that we know. But it's not that the world wasn't making war at the time, and as we were saying before, every single people on earth historically had fought exclusively in the name of God in any single culture. There is no other historical reality present. Every single people. Think about just the paganism. If you sacrifice, if you to persecute, the God's will, and the omen is negative, you can't literally go at war, right? So every single military action was exclusively based on a religious factor. If there was no other way to go to die for it, and not doing it for that principle. All the I'm very, I don't know, I don't want to use offensive terms, but, I've found a lot of alienated kids, mostly from those countries in Europe that still haven't properly gotten what the hell, the West is. Either sometimes because, probably they're too uneducated, their parents are ignorant, and or they come from a completely materialistic and atheistic context, mostly of post-socialist nature, that they are fed with the anti-clerical bullshit that it's easier to kill in the name of God than God meant in a theistic sense, and that's where they also contradict themselves linguistically, and not in the name of Odin or the name of Jupiter, like the entire Germanic or Roman or whatever we're talking, they were based exclusively on this military principle. It's not that aside from the Asen there was any other thing. It was only military. The Romans conquered the entire world in the name of Jupiter. The universal glory of the sky, the Achaemenid did the same thing. For the Indo-European glory, it was all and exclusively religious. And people can say, no, it's this damn theism, man. They ruin everything. So I understand that people don't study history of religion anymore. They don't even know what it is. They think that studying history of religion is being a religious person forcefully. These are things that, in any Western humanistic faculty are regularly taught with. It's like an enormous chunk of all the humanities since, centuries and centuries and centuries. Like, you can't even find an origin, basically, to this, because since we were here, we always talk about religion in the first place. There are theistic and atheistic professors. What do you think they do in their life? Right? Why do you think we study religion? Do you know what religion is? Right? Not the bullshit that your family told you, that your cousin told you, that your, schoolmates told you. Do you actually know that this is a discipline, a science, a subject, a faculty, something that needs a lifetime of studying to learn? Do you realize that? Or do you think that you can learn that just, through the internet, right? Yeah, if you listen to my videos, you will have the divine path open. I can assure you that, but I don't think you can do it if you don't spit blood by yourself, of course. I'm struck to the point we really are, because you see, we're supposed to be intelligent at this point. Instead, for the first time, this is scientifically proven, for the first time after generations, IQs are going down. Right? It's not that they have ever been ever satisfactory in terms of human decency, but let's say at least they were going up. Now they're going down. So it's official. Right? We already knew that, by the way. It was not a surprise, but just for the sake of precision. So much more than one is generally inclined to believe in the ideology of the Crusades, the liberation of the Temple of Jerusalem, the conquest of the Holy Land, has points in contact with the Indo-European tradition, and basically with any other tradition out there. What is the mythical Asgard to you, to the distant land of Asen and heroes, where death has no dominion, and the inhabitants enjoy an immortal life and supernatural peace? What's the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem? What is monasticism? Right? Where did Christ die and resurrect in the ultimate struggle? The Holy War appeared as a totally spiritual war, to the point that it could be literally compared by preachers to a, quote, purification like the fire of purgatory even before death. Which is a very good expression, because purgatory in that sense, which the beginning of Crusades didn't even properly exist, at least in the way it was formulated later, chiefly by Dante and so on, but let's say was still perceived as the fact that, in purgatory, where is purgatory? Purgatory is on earth. It's on physical earth. It's not a random place. Hell is also a physical place. It has to be physical because it's physicality that brings that passion that you have to contain. Purgatory is also on, actually would be, if you studied the comedy, that was for a full-fledged, cosmological representation of Earth and universe and so on. That's on, the earthly paradise, but it's literally earth, because that's where you have to endure things. You cannot endure anything in heaven, because heaven is just the place of perfection. You can reach it only in death, right? So that's why Dante's comedy is quite fascinating in this, if you read it on the tradition of the light of the Indo-European tradition, because there are different, it's something posterior, because the Middle Ages were definitely just already secularized and modernized their own way. But the idea that Dante properly has died at some point, because he has lost himself into the darkness, and he's stopped by which animal? There are three, but the most important one is the wolf, according to you. Why is there? And then he has literally to go through, and he eventually reaches heaven, and so that's kind of a different thing. And Dante was, very peculiar figure, and so on. But it would be the unique one, like a prophet and so on. And there is much else we can't digress on, and what properly Christianity saw at some point. Even this, we've just said it, the way you could achieve sanctity in a way. But that's complex. We'll talk about on another time. But let's say the quote that we could put here is one of Bernard of Clairvaux. While addressing the Templars, it says, quote, "What better glory for you to come out of battle laurel wreaths, but how much greater the glory of conquering an immortal crown on the battlefield." The absolute glory, the same that is attributed by theologians to God in the heights of heaven, in excelsis Deo, was also commended to the crusader by God. And this is nothing else but the same older traditional principle of divinity providing you through faith that wisdom that was necessary to push yourself to the limit in order to accomplish the greatest feat of all. And against this background stood, of course, Jerusalem, so the holy city, according to a double aspect, because it's an earthly city and a celestial one at the same time, right? And the crusade as an elevation that really leads to immortality. So that the alternating military outcomes of the Crusades, of course, were also read in function of how more or less perfect the fate of the Crusader was, of Christendom altogether was, right? So that it produced wonder. I mean, the First Crusade was a hell of an accomplishment, without sounding too blasphemous. But confusion and even vacillation of faith at some other point. But it's not that strange that, together with the Crusades, at least the Near Eastern ones, at least in the canonic ones that we count, the West was in a kind of a crisis, a kind of, contracting, and kind of secularizing, modernizing brutally. We talked a lot about the crisis of the late 13th century and the first half of the 14th. So a completely different approach that is somewhat more, modernistic, even to international policy, right? So we have to realize as a civilization that this moral change has occurred in this pretty macroscopic thing that is still going on, and of course to the descent actually of the moral dimension in this whole. Because we have not united, this is the main problem, we have not united our scientific knowledge with our moral duty, right? Moral duty is going down as long as things went easier because we knew how to make things work better. The point would be to combine both, because science is not antithetic to this. The same Indo-Europeans thought, same Christians, that the world had to be known, had to be learned, right? You studied the skies to understand the world, right? The Indo-Europeans had quite a complex mythology in this sense. The world in the creation has been entrusted in seigneury to mankind. Do you realize what this means? it's a faculty of command. It's not different from the Imperium, because it's God-given. And anything God-given must be respected as sacred, which is hardly ever conceived, starting from life in the first place. Don't kill innocent people. I think that's a pretty valid moral, realization, right? So the idea is that, of course, you can understand it the same way modernism and secularism has purified the idea of holy war from any residual spirituality, is the product that aforementioned materialism and loss of the sacred and the divine, and together with it the concept of action, because in the moment in which you kill that, again, as we were saying before, you become a chthonic mass to be dominated, because you don't have a motivation on your own. This is exactly what is happening right now, again. So, this sense, as we were saying before, the unfortunate outcome of a crusade was likened to virtue haunted by misfortune, the value of which can only be judged and rewarded in relation to an unearthly life. But thus, the value judgment on the spiritual aspect of action was concentrated. So beyond victory or defeat, because at the end of the day, this is at least part of the same medieval process of modernization and secularization, because at that point there was a greater acknowledgement of the fact, of course, that you could not believe that somebody could, there was always sin, as we were saying before. So that was already integrated in the concept that, of course, whatever whatever enterprise you choose to undertake is doomed, right? This is a universal evidence, right? In the Indo-European tradition, is that this was not even envisaged. It was said, let's just see what happens, and let's let God decide. So that, again, everything positive happening to you and everything negative happening to you was seen as deserved, right? Whereas, the Gospel says something very different, that is, justice is not of this world. And so it doesn't matter how much earthly authorities, secular authorities strive, they will never be perfect, right? But even in there was not lost the idea that you should strive towards it. Because still the idea of infinity, of an asymptotic capacity to reach in a realm that was there for you, that you knew was bigger, too much of a, of a bite to swallow altogether, but say for a human possibility, but still it was possible, right? It's like a record. You cannot say a record can never be broken at some point. There is a limit beyond which you can't. It's impossible. Physically, mathematically doesn't make any sense, because you can infinitely do something more, infinitely something smaller, but still. So everything. Remember the phrase from the Mahabharata before: what is beyond the intellect and beyond what you can achieve in this sense, you still have to achieve that you don't know, but that you will acquire if you try. That's where what you have to strive. It's connected to the action. That's the point, right? And this is especially addressed to the secular dimension, as we will see at the end of the video, and not properly to the priestly one. So it's interesting, because also in medieval Europe something else was going on. But again, we'll talk about this on another occasion. So we can say that holy war was worth in itself, right? Regardless of its visible results, as a means of achieving superhuman fulfillment with the active sacrifice of the human element. The Indo-Europeans rose this to a metaphysical expression, because that's the only realm in which it could work, after all, also for them, everybody should emulate in the first place. It's like von Clausewitz's concept of absolute war. There are some passages from the Formkriege that actually talk about this, where absolute war is war, say, unhinged from reality, that von Clausewitz expresses to explain what war would be, were it just a pure, clash of forces and nothing else. So these metaphysical myths were quite similar to the concept, because we're naturally describing the superhero, right, the godlike one. And so this is important to understand for understanding war itself in the Clausewitzian theory, because absolute war, which is not total war, by the way, as it was misinterpreted, and still some people think that von Clausewitz was advocating for. Of course, he was showing it to explicitly express why it cannot be achieved, because war is always restrained by reality, and as thus we have to cope, because there is that dramatic pressure, the same one that perfects the soul, and that's what von Clausewitz believed. So it's part of the same theory. Is properly the one that we have to learn about in order to be capable in it in the first place, and in any struggle for that matter, because it all starts from the moral dimension, and this is the base of the Clausewitzian theory itself. So it turns out that these ancient beliefs, as they are actually perfectly scientific in nature, right? It's just the hubris, and in fact the Chthonic and Dionysian imperfection of a modernistic and selfish and cowardly and inferior thought that properly, began to deride whatever was essentially for the entire history of mankind there for a reason, that began not to understand anymore, because it was detached from the action and from the necessity that was to be understood in order to carry the same out. So if we look at these teachings, it reappears in the well-known Bhagavad Gita that we quoted already before. So the compassion and humanitarian sentiments that keep the warrior Arjuna from taking the field against the enemy are judged by the god that says to Arjuna, vile, unworthy of a noble, and which they preclude from heaven. Now, at the beginning of the Funkriege, there is that famous phrase von Clausewitz says, those who have kind of humanitarian, philanthropic, ideas that think that war can be waged in a less bloody way just to make it, to save people's lives, are actually the worst, because they are the ones that will protract the war, that will not make it happen immediately and settling the matter as with, at the moment the greatest amount of bloodshed possible, but in the longer run, the least, considering how war actually protracts in reality, and he was pretty damn right, is coincident with this idea, because it's coincident with the necessity of moral forces. If you want to destroy an enemy, isn't it better to a single dramatic blow than having to jump around in a exhausting duel that will make at the end of the day more resources being spent to destroy it, and also procrastinating, by the way, the outcome in exposing yourself still to the enemy itself, right? Of course, that's why reality puts us those limitations, also because the enemy is not sitting there just being attacked by you, but in theory that's the asymmetry that you're searching for, and that in war we all search for in order to deliver that strike with less bloodshed as possible, but delivering that damn strike, so not coming out of the fight at all. So going for that violence, full mo, but still with an intelligence, knowing how to help that, so to make it work. So while unworthy of noble, in which they preclude from heaven, you cannot live tranquil if you hope that after all war is kind of bad, we should never do it, man, and it doesn't matter that other countries are being invaded or enslaved, and let's just hope it doesn't happen here for now, and we're fine. And I don't know anything about war, so even if I have to fight one, I don't even know. I don't care to study strategy for a lifetime in order to even understand a minimal part of it, to hope that it has a positive outcome in war. It's not important. Just hope it doesn't happen. Let's all kind of disarm everybody, and let's be just open, let's open our door to anybody and let's everybody in until, they will take everything. And at that point, even, it's not really worth fighting because, violence is bad, man. You shouldn't do it. So this is the general idea. Of course, this is cowardice. I bought it. And the point here is that war has a logic on its own that is, of course, declined on a political and social level, so that there must be a reason, first of all, to make the war in the first place. But that when it has to be waged, has to follow a specific logic. By the way, unworthy of a noble, consider that the Arya literally are the noble, right? So the term Aryan that has been crossed out as, as a sort of racist term, is actually a term that is manifestly overt and inclusive to anybody who was noble, as most, steppe peoples were actually, the most powerful, was well seen to join in to make the bunch stronger. And this nobility was measured on this intelligence that is the same one that should preclude from war, because in the mythology, let's say, of the Indo-European peoples, like the heavens are perfect. Why? Because only the noble stand there. Only perfection is there. The problem comes from the below. Comes from those who, were complaining with others because they cannot solve their own problems. Right? But at the same time, in order to achieve that calm, that superiority, that inner strength, you must have learned how to wage war itself. This is probably one of the greatest lessons in the history of civilization, reason for which, our destructive capacities have, of course, increased the more civilization has increased. Right? If those racist culturalists, that teach you that only barbarians make war, and so that, war is just fought by the vile, I think they haven't quite understood what is the progress at this point. So that civilization would have become less functional, or less powerful, or less effective, for that matter. Have we reduced our military capacity? Have we, somewhat regressed on the necessity of having a defense or a military or a strategic culture? Right? If anything, we have lost it actually over time, because we have, say, detached the masses of people, in fact, from this deep civic duty of a democratic reality, where more or less everybody should have the worth and the dignity and the responsibility and the superiority to know how to bear arms for the strength of the wall, right? But war has not disappeared, right? And especially our capacities to wage it have increased, and great part of the reason why actually we're paradoxically living in a quite peaceful time in history is exactly thanks to the deterrent force of arms. So, still quoting the Bhagavad Gita, the comment sounds like this: killed, you will have paradise. Winner, you will rule on earth. Therefore, stand up resolutely to battle. This is Vedic India from millennia ago. Killed, you will have paradise. Winner, you will rule the earth. This is what people believed at the time. Just for those who thought that, those damn theists, man, those damn monotheists, damn it, they invented, holy war. What bastards, what sadistic people, what obscurantists, disgusting. Vedic India, killed, you will have paradise. Winner, you will rule on earth. And that's basically what all people, not just believed, but lived up to. Meaning that, if you know what the representative models of power and warfare were those times, you know what we're talking about. So the inner disposition which can transmute the individual through this growth from the smaller form to the ever greater is greatly described also in the following quote: "While you dedicate every action to me," affirms the God, "and your spirit is fixed in the supreme state of the ego, far from any thought of possession, free from fever in the spirit, fight." So, in other words, don't care, like don't let your goal being obscured by other, transient, passions, hopes, like something you just depend on. Just think in this moment of your life, think what would happen, for example, if we didn't have the internet. You would freak out. Is it possible that, millions of years of evolution brought to this? Like to you not being able, like you're designed to be, hunting mammoths and things like that. The question is, you properly depend on this now. You're so weak that you depend on this. Of course, there is much that is connected to even the internet, and I agree, and it's important. But would you know how to survive in the wild? I don't. Right, I don't think you do, but I think we could also learn quite quickly if we were there, right? Because it turns out that when under pressure, we find a way. We are designed for doing that. So it's mostly ourselves putting ourselves in a condition to ignore what is not just, something that goes beyond the bare, like, the most immediate necessities, and not the greater picture that this whole thing has in our own, that lays in our own capacity and action and potential. This is valid also from a mental point of view. Banally, why are you listening to me and not reading a book about this? Hopefully you will, right? But it's dramatically easy, as you found me, to find something else. I just know that most of my followers will not do it. Now, in equally clear expressions, the purity of this action is affirmed in the poem, because it must be willed in itself beyond any material purpose, beyond any passion and any human impulse, because you have to be divine. That's at least what you have to strive for. And the quote goes by saying, "While you place pleasure and pain, advantage and loss, victory and defeat on the same level of value, arm yourself for the fight. Thus, no guilt will be imputed to you." This is a deep meaning, because the poem is a story. Arjuna is, his battle for moral reason, for problems of, naturally of fidelity. Now, the thing, let's not digress, but let's say he poses himself a question like, what do I have to do? There is an existential question posed there, because it is what we pose ourselves all the time in front of a choice, right? So when you are in war, we know that war is basically the activity in which the greatest stake, the greatest, let's say, necessity for command, for individual command, and the farthest away from predictability of outcome is concentrated in human action, right? So there are much more important things than war going on a much different scale in time, etc. But war is factually the only one that has this characteristic, this chaotic characteristic, that, however, we can't keep under. And it turns out that we are genetically programmed on the basis of such conflictuality to sort out, right, and to also fight properly, also in a physical sense. So losing purpose and meaning stems from pretending to know anything without actually going for it in the first place. And losing that purpose means that you have already lost the habit to that kind of mechanism, because you have already kept yourself out of the fray on such a regular basis that you're not able to connect the meaning from the action. And this is exactly what is happening today. So here the God says, what are you worried for? You're a warrior. So fight. And you will find the answer. And don't think about the rest, because you cannot know. And this is the point. You will know only when you will get to the utmost sacrifice. Before you cannot know. And this is also in religion, what most people, in fact, do not understand. But they do not understand religion anymore. That religion is not a shortcut to the club of cool people that do the right thing all the time, have a better life, and can show off. Religion means being eager to suffer. Because if you don't understand what this means, you fundamentally cannot understand anything about your own existence in the first place. And so deluding yourself that this is otherwise is mirrored by the loss of meaning. Is presuming that an abstract knowledge, a purely contemplative attitude, or some kind of wishful thinking will fix things, both within you and outside of you. It will not happen. You have already lost. You have already given up the initiative. It's over. This is exactly what is happening to our civilization right now. And you see what it says here. Thus, you see, arm yourself for the fight. Don't think even about the outcome, because you cannot know what the outcome will be. It's useless. You cannot know the outcome. You can maybe calculate the odds in the moment in which you have to decide whether to go to war or not. In that sense, this is a kind of a total fight, so it could not be even. We are at other levels, But the point here is that when it concludes, thus no guilt will be imputed to you. This is exactly the point. If you will have done everything was necessary, doesn't even matter whether you win or lose at that point, because it's what you should be all at least directed to, aimed at. That's what matters, because if you don't even think of it, and if you already waver, it's over in the first place. So victory is important. It's the most important thing, right? But metaphysically, you will fail in your life. But if you lose the necessity of keeping to fight, that will be the true defeat. So, and you will be properly to be blamed for that. This is the most important thing that we have completely erased. We said, if the important is really not, they tell you, if you've done your best, well, okay, if it was just one shot at that point, you can torture yourself for the rest of your life. But first of all, you have to still live with it, so you can't quite live as if that was not real or the deal. So this idea that everything happens because of good and bad things happen to you in some ways is correct, meaning that you cannot really claim that in your life you didn't do anything, or even just for the fact of being alive, that you there is something that you're properly not seeing or understanding that couldn't justify what is happening to you in a way, not in a strange justice idea that you may have matured because it's faulty in itself, but properly what the whole thing is that we have no clue about. What is important here is that as long as you have force, you have to go on. And this is usually never told. This is just said, calm this thing down and don't think about it anymore. Well, why shouldn't you think about it anymore? Like, what is that you wanted? Why didn't you get it? You can't really take it away, right? Your point would be to always progress, in a sense, not to be just a static imbecile who, is afraid of any negative feeling or anything wrong that can happen to him, and say, that's how I hope, looking at the clock, before how much I have left before I die. Because that's exactly what will have made you dissolve into nothingness, quite literally, in your life itself. You should always be spurred, and that brings a great pressure. And it does turn out that human beings under pressure can do extraordinary things. We want to eliminate that pressure. And the archetypical alternative to that is parasitism. Because if you don't accomplish anything yourself, who's gonna sustain you in the first place? Why would you have just to sit there asking for that? Like, what is that is in your faculties that you cannot achieve properly in a broader existential sense? And we're not talking about in abstract terms. I mean, look at what the majority of people actually do in that sense. Is there anything sacred in what people kind of do? Right? It's not that modern civilization doesn't achieve feats even through the hard work of lots of people, but are these people doing that just because they are, just tied into a sort of slavery, or are they because they have any purpose whatsoever? And are they told that they have a purpose in the first place, or are just pure martyrs or would-be heroes that just would, were just oppressed by terrible forces that they cannot break free from? Because this is the narrative that is taking place, right? That, there's kind of a rigged system that keeps you under. This is a superstition. Because it's not that the system is made of, some, super force that, is, just true in itself and you can't even scratch the surface of it. We're talking about the world. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about moral forces that are constantly floating and where there is always kind of a niche of something to exploit. Like, it's never just a system, or even if the system takes place again, don't you think that it took place because people gave up, because people got lazier? Or those people who complain about this, do you think that you actually are oppressed, and that there is a system now that is making you living really bad, that and compared to, I don't know, your grandparents' life? Do you ever compare your life to your grandparents' one? Do you think that on average human beings today have it more difficult than their grandparents in general? That their grandparents would even think of complaining in certain situations that are not even yours in comparison, are not even 1/10, to be generous, as hard, and they would just go for it because they knew what the reward was, and they had a bit of a steadier mind and force than the one you have now. Why do you think there is an epidemic of mental illness right now? Do you think it's just for the years we're all strained? That you think that there is something going on? You lying to yourself in order to give up and getting lazier and lazier, for wanting more and more from others, from other stuff, putting your center of gravity outside of yourself because you're too lazy for doing it yourself, and you hope to be maintained like that forever. What do you think that was a feminine attribute to the Chthonic, Dionysian, barbaric masses? This is not meant in a male and female in a biological sense. This is meant in a metaphysical sense. It's the idea of the great mother that swallows her children in the end because she doesn't want them to grow up into complete beings. It's the great mother of the Pelasgian religions that the Indo-Europeans came to rule over. It's a principle of mere dependency. And psychoanalytically speaking, if you just take away the male figure or the female figure from a human being, you commit one of the single greatest damage to a human being that is possible, because you effectively don't teach them to balance themselves out between the two. And again, in a broader sense, this is what we're coming to be again: chthonic masses, very weak ones, completely deprived of strength, of capacity to react, of resistance, of force. Right? It's easy also to complain about this yet because most people have now been living in ways that for which they have never known what it was like before. And definitely the mass scale ignorance in actual history, and especially in this kind of history, not the oversimplified materialistic bullshit that you're taught in school or wherever, also at university largely, is is going to make any difference. So as a further metaphysical foundation, we can say that in the Mahabharata, the god illuminates the difference between what is absolute spirituality and as such indestructible. That is the archetype. That's where you have to struggle for. That is the truth. And what has as a corporal and human element only an illusory existence. And this is actually a deeply rational thought, because it is true that, when you suffer, it's tough, because suffering is always both mental and physical. And when it's just physical, in the sense you have an accident that hurts you or something, you know in that moment that it's painful like hell, but that at the end of the day, you're suffering, you're being brought to the limits even of your mental resistance, because you understand that if you understand, by the way, what is happening to you, you can rationalize that this is, as painful as it is, and in that sense incurable as it is, it's still something that happens in a normal sense, and that your mind, which is active in another direction, is at another level, let's say, is not equally susceptible of, because matter itself doesn't do anything, right? There can be natural phenomena that, of course, we have to cope with, but it's not that they do it with a will. The only will there is, as far as we know, is in our mind. So whatever it is really the most important thing of all in the struggle between the two archetypes, this one of the light and of reason, and of this also military capacity, is the most important of the two. Is the one at least towards which you should strive, and that of course your physical earthly dimension is rowing in the opposite direction of, because it's a burden, but it's not because it has a logic on its own. And that is what the meaning is, that you should strive for that wisdom to be acquired, because the other direction is a non-place, it's just an involution. And that's the primitive meaning of hell. It's nothingness. Because there was nothing. That's why, in fact, these Pelagian cultures were, for example, scared, terrorized by blood, by contamination, all these things, because they thought there was some force behind that. They didn't see it was just, matter in itself. There was no divine principle in it. So this Indo-European conquerors saw pretty clearly what the difference that commanding on somebody's mind, even in that sense, could make to discipline, to cooperate, to coordinate, to administrate, to rule. And they knew better, because those had to fight as warlike peoples against other people, right? Not against, accidents. And so, what is the most important thing? Is to sort out science, just how the world works, and then what are you going to do with that? Don't you think there is a meaning in history, in politics, in war, in society? Like, it's not that science is not important. You should use it to understand all these things. But the question is, what do you think it gets down to? It's a pure materialistic understanding that matters. This is what you've been fed for. I've met even school teachers that said, history, I don't like it, too much war. Let's teach kids just science. I mean, these people are, in a moral sense, I don't distinguish them from totalitarian, regimes people. they are completely breaking apart the meaning of civilization. This both is both the elements, and prevalently actually the one of the spirit, the one of meaning, which is by far more complex, deeper, and more important than anything material. So on the one hand, the character of metaphysical unreality, what can be lost as a passing life and mortal body, or the loss of which can be conditioning for others, by the way, is revealed. We're all gonna die anyway, so what will have been more important for you? And in the poem, Arjuna is led to the experience of that form of manifestation of the divine, to an overwhelming power in an irresistible absoluteness. The same absolute. What is more infinite to you, or what is more relevant for you? The apparent infinity of space, or the apparent infinity of your mind's possibilities? Faced with the magnitude of this force, every conditioned form of existence appears as a negation. How could it? Where this denial is actively denied, that is, where in the assault every conditioned form of existence is overwhelmed or destroyed, this force comes to a terrifying manifestation. On this basis, it is possible to grasp exactly the energy that is suitable for arousing the heroic transformation of the individual. Why do you think we study war? Because in the proportion in which Arjuna is able to operate in the purity, in absoluteness already indicated, the warrior breaks the chains of the human, evokes the divine as a metaphysical force, draws this active force upon himself, finding his enlightenment and liberation in it. Do you want to be determined, or do you want to determine yourself? So there is a beautiful metaphor, password of another text belonging to the same Mahabharata. Sounds like life like a bow, soul like an arrow, the absolute spirit as a target to be pierced, to unite with this spirit as the shot arrow sticks in its target. Now this is from Clausewitz, by the way, guys. I don't know if you recognized it, but it's life is the bow, is the, if you want, this existence that by itself doesn't actually determine much of what you're going to do with that. Right? Can you evaluate the value properly? Can you evaluate a person? Of course we can. Right? What person is better? Just in terms of will, a person that has all the same imagine two people have all the same possibility. One does nothing, one does lots of stuff. Who's better? There is an objective qualitative value in that person that does things in achieving them, succeeding, right? Bringing to a greater scope in action that can also reveal to other people that meaning. So the soul says, like an arrow, because the soul is the one that projects itself in life. And the absolute spirit as a target to be pierced. You have to reach the absolute belief in your action through knowledge, through courage. Because if you don't have both, you can't do anything factually. So the purpose is uniting with this spirit as the arrow shot sticks in its target, and so become one with them. And obviously the ultimate purpose is the truth, is the absolute, is the infinite. It cannot be attained, but what stands between us and that is infinite. That is, nobody knows what happens, even just in between. we're still at a tiny, minimal, insignificant fraction of a part of just thinking to start. As people, as in history, as a civilization, in everything. So if we can see here the highest form of spiritual realization, of struggle and heroism, then it is truly significant that this teaching is presented in the Bhagavad Gita as belonging to an Indo-European solar primordial inheritance. And in fact, this knowledge was imparted by the son to the first Indo-European legislator in the Vedic tradition in Manu, and subsequently guarded by a dynasty of sacred kings. This is important because over the centuries this teaching was lost, by the way, and eventually revealed again by the divinity, not to a priest, but to a representative of the warrior nobility, the Arjuna. And this means something deeply important, that is to say that those who are in charge of anything, it can be a family, it can be any group, a state, it can be the world entire, are the ones who must own this spiritual realization. Because they are the ones called to act. With all the enormous responsibility that derives from it. Now, I hope that this was, at least we will go on with this, because by the way, the doctrine, Indo-European doctrine of victory, and is something deeper than this, right? Of course, there is much more. I mean, and for today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.